Good morning, dear friends. It's Thanksgiving, November 25th, the 21st of Kislev. We're celebrating nonstop. We're getting ready for Hanukkah. It's going to be this Sunday night. And we're gathered here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. In the moment, Masechet Shabbat, chapter 10, Perek Hamatzniya. And we are on 91A, soon to be 91B. As noted, today is Thanksgiving. There's a lot going on. There's many of our dear friends have places to go, people to see, family, visitors, or turkeys to stuff. And the fact that you take time out of your busy day to study Gemara is once again a beautiful testament to the devotion and the value of Torah in our lives. And I want to give a big Yasher Koyach. We are talking about carrying, and we're talking about carrying things that are their identities are fluid. What I mean by that is, if they're considered chashuv in their minuscule amount or not is somewhat subjective. It's somewhat dependent on the perspective and the desire of the owner of the item. And we're talking about how sometimes the facts on the ground can shift rapidly, and that may have an impact on if it is considered carrying or not. When I make that introduction, it sounds, super confusing, but with Hashem's help, we'll see that it's only a little confusing. So let us begin. Yesterday, as you may recall, we talked about a shrinking and expanding a handful of seeds, the size of a fig, less than a fig, more than a fig. If you carry it and it changes, we had a whole bunch of different variations and different possible thoughts. And the Gemara ends off with an answer that could be frustrating, but also lets us know that we're at the end of the line. The Gemara answered Teku, all of these nuanced situations, particularly does something change? Does it become another entity? I tried using, Mark, what do we call it? Teleporting?
Teleporting.
We tried to use teleporting as a mashal. I hope I got it right. The people that are bucky in science fiction maybe will claim otherwise, but we said that a person teleports, so they start out at point A.
Like Star Trek,
Sorry?
Like they,
Right.
Star Trek, they would beam them up. They would turn them into something and reappear in a new location.
Right. So the question is, are you the same person? Has something changed in the interim?
Are you?
And so here we have a single fruit or series of fruits. It started out in point A like this. It ended up in point B like that. In the middle, something happened. Does that affect its status? Does it affect its identity or not? And the Gemara ends off with take, but that was yesterday's discussion. So we get a little science fiction, we get some psychology or attempted psychology, and everything else when you study the Gemara. New question, I'm going to need your help with this one. Ba'u or ba'amine Rava mi Rav Nachman. Rava asked Rav Nachman another question. It's a question that I believe we're going to wonder what the Gemara wonders, which is, what is the question? He said like this: imagine Zorak Kizayis Truma. You're a Kohen, or maybe non-Kohen, you have possession of Truma. Truma is special food, sanctified food, that is gifted to the Kohen. And he throws it, lebeis tamei mahu. He throws it into a house that is impure. What is the deal? Is it a problem?
Because it has no value. It'll have no value once it's tamei.
Let's see. So the Gemara asks Lamai, what exactly is the nature of this question? Ila inyan Shabbos, if we're asking if you're liable for transport.
Tamei, Truma is no longer usable.
So let's see in a moment. It's more than that. There's consequences for causing Truma to become tamei, but only a certain measure. So the Gemara says, what's your question? Okay, so now let's imagine this. You took a little piece of Truma and you chucked it into the window of a house that's impure. So Lamai, what's the issue? What is the specific issue we're honing in on? Ila in Shabbos, if you're wondering if it is considered transporting something that you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. To be liable for carrying food on Shabbos, it needs to be the size of a dried fig.
But there's no hanacha.
When it lands, that's the hanacha.
You don't have to have a physical hanacha.
Rika could also be a problem when you're triggering and you're allowing it to land. So ila in Shabbos kigro geres ba'inan. If the issue is carrying on Shabbos, so it's the size of a dried fig. And the dried fig apparently is larger than an olive, than an egg. And so what you've thrown, I'm sorry, if you throw the volume of a zayis, so for Shabbos, it's not a problem because it needs to be a grogeris. A grogeris is a dried fig, it's larger than olive. So you did not carry to be liable biblically. You didn't carry to be liable in the most extreme sense. Eating into my, if the issue is that you caused food to become impure, and there are consequences associated with causing truma to become impure, and perhaps it cannot be consumed by anyone else. It has to be burnt, maybe. So then kibesa achlin ba'inan. It needs to be the size of an egg. So basically, this little olive size of food should not trigger a Shabbos problem, nor should it really trigger a truma problem. So what was the question? So the Gemara answers, L'olam. In truth, in Shabbos, the question had to do with carrying on Shabbos. What's the question? You have in the house food, excuse me, less than the size of an egg. And the food that you've thrown in now fuses together to become the size of an olive. Rashi, shenacha etzloi, they landed next to each other. V'hishlimo, and it became one unit. Va'idei hanachazu nitmu, and now that it was placed together, it all became it became the size of an olive, and it became impure. So again, let's back up. We're talking about Shabbos. Now, food ended up fusing together. For the purposes of impurity, it is a problem. You now have a kezayis of impure food. So our question is, now that we know that for Truma there's a problem, let's figure it out to Shabbos. Here's the question. Being that these two food items fuse together to be a problematically discontaminated piece of Truma, do we say mechayev nami le'inyan Shabbos? Your throwing of food changed reality. It was impactful. It made a difference. It triggered a benchmark of impurity. So should you also be chayiv for carrying or causing to travel this food, a kezayis on Shabbos? You're wondering what's this question. I'm also wondering what's the question. But let's basically, if the throwing was effective to change reality and to fuse the two food items together, maybe we also look at it as a single item for the purpose of Shabbos, that you ended up triggering the travel or the movement of what ultimately is chashuv. I'm trying to think of a good example. You ever went to one of those vending machines in an amusement park, and for $10 you could buy a can of Coke, and you put in $9.75? You still can't get a Coke. But if someone is kind enough to give you a single quarter, now you can get your $10 Coke. So the 25 cents, the last quarter, is that chashuv or not? So it's not usually chashuv because you can't buy a Coke for 25 cents. If you've already put in $9.75, that one quarter is going to be very chashuv. I don't know if that's a good mashal, but maybe that's what we're saying.
No.
You don't like it?
No.
My point is, you can have something that's typically not significant, but when it's fused together with something else, it becomes part of a significant package. And so its movement was impactful. So we're saying is, listen, Professor, if you don't like my mashal, then I retract. So the point is that if this little piece of truma fused together to become a problem for truma, do we retroactively understand that this piece of truma, as it was flying through the air and landed in the house, was actually very chashuv? Why? Because
we have a saying about the last straw that breaks the camel's back.
right.
But on the other hand, actually, you need all other straws for the last straw to break the neck. And the same with the last quarter.
So
And
respectfully,
from that point of
Professor,
view, the last quarter is not different from all previous quarters that you put. But in this case, in Gemara, we have foods of different nature, so it's not obvious that they are all the same from the point of view of impurity.
So I will give you a different Marshall. You have the four Arba Minim.
Doctor, just give me 3 seconds. Professor, I think your argument is actually the winning argument of the Gemara. And my argument is the reason why it was a question. So it's possible that I'm going to ask you to revisit the mashal and maybe we'll give it some redemption. But, Doctor, please share with us your better mashal.
So I don't know if it's better, but so you have Arba Minim, but you're missing a netro.
Yes.
So as far as the mitzvah is concerned, you can't. It's worthless to have the 4 minim without the etrog. Once you add the etrog to it, which is different, it's not the same as the others. It becomes a whole.
So you So something that activates, it causes activation. Maybe it's more chashuv.
It's good mashal.
Maybe not. So the doctor's mashal is the arba minim. To do the mitzvah. Now, if we're going to someone's going to listen to this later and they're going to do some research or they're going to be very fluent with the sugya of what do you do if you don't have all the arba minim. And so Lamaisa, if we're going to get into the nitty gritty, it might be complicated, but generally speaking, it's a good mashal. We have the 4 kinds. They're only activated when when a circuit is made and you have all the 4 items are together. And so the esrog is very chashuv. And also 1 arava is very chashuv because it activates the item. And so therefore it becomes something of chashivas. So let's see the Gemara again. You threw a little piece of truma into an impure house. And we want to know what the question was. And the Gemara says it's about Shabbos. And the reason why it's even a question is because it fuses together with a greater chunk of food that's in the house. And for the laws of purity, we are certain that it's effective. Being that it's effective to trigger tuma, it gets you your coke, it gives you the mitzvah of the arba minim. Maybe mechayiv nami ligin Shabbos. You should also be chayiv for the purposes of Shabbos. The Gemara says, oidilma. Alternatively, ko ligin Shabbos ki gregeres ba'inon. When it comes to Shabbos, the only significant measure is a dried fig, and here there is no dried fig. What happens afterwards, what happens in another halachic context, is not relevant to our conversation. Rashi, this little chunk adds to the other chunk. They land together. And it all becomes impure by landing together. Shiur and Kegageris, or we say on Shabbos, you're only chayiv if you actually carried a gogeris, even though this piece is more impactful, it punches above its weight. That's not compelling. Amrlei Tinei Sua. So Rava asked Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman says, let's try to figure this out with the following. Abba Shaul taught, Shtei Alechem, the bread, v'lechem aponim, different breads that were associated with in the Beis Hamikdash. The lechem aponim, we know it's on the shulchan, and the Shtei Alechem was connected to Yontif. If you carry it, shiuron kigro geres. If you carry it out on Shabbos, you won't be liable until it's the size of a grogeres, a dried fig. Gemara says from here we can infer to take the professor's position, which is that for Shabbos, all that matters is the actual measure and not a little piece, even if it is impactful. And so he says, V'amai, why do we say that you're only chayiv if you carry a grogeres? Lema, maybe using the rationale that we tried to say over here. A little piece of bread could be a problem on Shabbos because it makes another problem for Tuma. We just turn the page to 91B. We know that you're not allowed to take holy food from the Beis Hamikdash. And if you transport it outside of the holy zone, you're liable if it's the size of an olive. So we'll say, you know what? Because for the purposes of taking food out of the temple, you're liable. Let's say this is a carry that's a problem. You've carried something that you're not allowed to carry If you're not allowed to carry it for the laws of the temple and the sanctity of the food, well, you should not be allowed to carry it for the purposes of Shabbos either. And the Gemara says, no. Maybe you'll say when it comes to carrying these breads from the Beis Hamikdash, you'll be chayiv for a smaller amount. And so therefore we can infer that you shouldn't be liable for a small volume of food, even though it ends up being halachically impactful, but not Shabbos. So Gemara says, Hachi Hashla, is this a good analogy? Hasam. When you carry food from the temple outside of the temple, you're liable even though you're still in the Eruv. You're still contained within the Temple Mount compound. So you would hit a biblical prohibition of removing sanctified food from its zone, but you clearly didn't do an act of carrying on Shabbos. But for carrying, you're only chayiv when you go outside of the Eruv. Maybe you'll say, Shabbos bahadi. So let me just remind you what happened. We had a question. You have a little fragment of food. If you carry it on Shabbos, it's as if you carried nothing because that little piece of food is nothing. We found a hypothetical where that little piece of nothing can be halachically impactful for another issue, the issue of purity and impurity. So is it considered carrying? So we thought we'd find an analogy. The analogy was of removing food from the temple, where although to remove food from the temple, the threshold is a smaller volume, you're not chayiv for carrying it on Shabbos until it's a higher volume. Grogeres. Then the Gemara said it's a bad analogy. You know why it's a bad analogy? Because the two different sins, the two different transgressions don't happen simultaneously. One could never have carried on Shabbos, but be liable for carrying something out of the temple. So the Gemara now says you wanted to bring an analogy, a halachic analogy to help us clarify what the law is about carrying this little fragment. And the Gemara says it's not a good analogy. Because Shabbos v'tumah, when it comes to throwing that little piece of bread and it lands next to another pile of bread, at the same moment, the item was transported and the item becomes fused together and comes impure. Rashi. Until it landed, for the purposes of Shabbos, it also wasn't the right measure for tumah. But ultimately, the Gemara's conclusion is Zora Kezayis Truma Labayis Tame Mahu. What's the halacha? I believe the answer is, well, what do you think? What's the halacha? Did the Gemara tell us the halacha? Gemara didn't actually give us a final answer. I don't think. What we have over here is a question. We have an attempt to understand the nature of the question. We said it's talking about Shabbos. We said that it's a specific scenario where it's also tummy. We tried to bring proof from the story of the Shtei Alechem. We said it's no good proof. And then we moved on. So the Gemara doesn't explicitly give us an answer. So let's take a peek. Let's see if it's brought in halacha. So let's see how the Rambam paskins here. Want to read the Rambam? Hoisi ki grogeres. This is going to go back in time a little bit to yesterday's Gemara. Hoisi ki grogeres la'achila. He's carrying a volume that's the size of a dried fig for eating. With some kind, it shriveled up. It lost some of its volume. It turned into raisins. And then it re-expanded. Must have been walking for a very long time non-stop for the fruit to shrivel up and then to reconstitute. Hareza Safik. So based on our Gemara that says Teku, the Rambam tells us there is a debate. Do we say that its pattern of flight was interrupted to the point where it isn't carrying or not? And the Rambam reminds us of the suffix. We don't know. Now, what's the din if Zorak Kezayis Eichelin Labayis Tameh? You threw a volume, an olive size of food into an impure house. V'hishlim Kezayis Zeh La'acholim Shayusham. And this little Kezayis fused with other foodstuffs. V'nasa Akol Kebetza, and it all became the size of an olive. An egg. How does the Rambam paskin? Rambam says, "Harei is a suffix in this chayiv al kezayis." We are not certain if you are chayiv or not. The Rambam says we're not certain. Why does the Rambam say he's not certain? I'm fairly certain. The reason why the Rambam is not certain is because the Gemara doesn't actually give us an answer. The Gemara just presents us with a question. Question without an answer. Why doesn't the Shulchan Aruch talk about this halacha? Why does only the Rambam talk about it? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Quite simply because the laws of impurity that we're describing here were not practiced in the time that the Shulchan Aruch was being recorded. And the Shulchan Aruch only writes things that are prevalent today, whereas the Rambam writes what is called Hilchas Mashicha. He gives the entire corpus of Jewish law, even those aspects of halacha that are not relevant in the time of the diaspora, the time of the Galus, or in the absence of the Beis
Since when
Hamikdash.
did that stop anybody from discussing anything?
No, so the Rambam writes halachas even if they aren't entirely applicable or relevant this moment, but the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, does not.
And no
And
one
so
else addressed it, and
no one else that's connected to our Safaria addresses it. Now I'll show you here. We'll open the Rambam and we'll look at, well, let's see. Who are our commentaries here? Just want to make sure we're on the right piece of Gemara. I think they bounced us. Hold on. Bear with me. Hold on, I lost the place. We're gonna have to go back and look for it again. I'm sorry. All right, so it's 1827. Open. Here we go, 1827. Let's see the Magid Mishnah. He says, Boyasham. Where does this question come from? The Gemara, which was that's yesterday's Gemara. Sham, in the Gemara, it says, Zar Kazayis Trumel the base Tame, Mahu. Lamai, eating in Shabbos. This is exactly the words of the Gemara. Vasikna, in Shabbos. The Gemara concludes that it is talking about Shabbos. In a unique scenario. Pachas Mechazayis, Mashlim the Beitza. Again, I'm just showing you the headlines where he's basically repeating our Gemara. What's the question? The Gemara wants to clarify, but ultimately does not give an answer. Now the Kesef Mishnah, I think it's the Kesef Mishnah, the Magid Mishnah. I'm sorry. The Magid Mishnah says, I have a big question. If the Rambam was trying to accurately portray the teaching the way it's in the Gemara, he should have mentioned that it's only if the food is truma, not random food. Kiloshan haba'aya, which would be an appropriate and accurate reflection of the Talmud. Umashma, and he infers, the Magid Mishnah infers that the Rambam thinks the question isn't really only about truma. I'm sorry. Umashma misapkel eliyin truma. Elo truma. Dilchulin kivan she'ein tumasei oisartan en ichshuva klum v'chein risalatizes. So basically, the Magid Mishnah seems to be disagreeing with the Rambam's, or he's challenging the Rambam's interpretation of our Gemara. The Magid Mishnah says, hold on, sorry, I lost the place over here. The Magid Mishnah is saying that he doesn't understand the Rambam. Why is the Rambam talking about regular food? It should have only been about truma, because the only time that food can do magic, can do unique tricks, and fuse together and be halachically problematic is if it's truma, not regular food.
I don't know if he's disagreeing with him. I think he's just explaining it.
He's explaining and asking a question.
Yeah, but there are certain issues of if you're chayav for eating a certain amount of, like treifa or whatever, if you have it combined. If you have a half a kazai to this and half a kazai to that. It also it's not just truma that combined for Isser.
Yeah. Tosfos makes a similar point that it would only be a question if there was some kind of activation. There was some kind of activation that happens by the throwing of the food, then you'll be liable. But let's say you have a full football size of tomadik food, No, I'm sorry, that wouldn't work. Let's say you have a full kib size of an egg of tamid food and you throw it. You wouldn't be chayiv for Shabbos because it's less than the gregaris, but you didn't activate anything when you threw it, so there's no chashivas. Long story short, the Gemara. What I really wanted to show you is that the Rambam and the way the Maggid Mishnah and the simple reading of the Rambam is that our Gemara does not give us a conclusion, and so it's left with a question mark, and that's indeed how the Rambam passes. That's really what I wanted to show. Let's finish the Mishnah. Folks, can you give us another 3-4 minutes, and then we'll give you a turkey bonus, free time. Chazer v'chnisai. Back to our Mishnah. A person designated something small and minuscule as chashuv, significant. When he carries it, he's liable. But when he puts it back on the shelf and he takes it back, he returns it and puts it back in the shed, now he has undesignated the item. Rashi, Gemara. If he puts it back, and this was the question. If you remember, when we learned the Mishnah, the professor was helping us clarify: was he chayiv for the first leg of the trip? And I told you I believe he was chayiv. But all that we're talking about now is the technicalities of the second leg of the trip. And I told you it's also possible that he put it away in the weekday, so he's not liable at all. But he's also canceled its special status. He no longer looks at the single seed as chashuv. Just wanted to remind you of that discussion. So the Gemara says, Pshita, it is so obvious. Why? Kivan delay zare, he went into his field and he decides not to plant it. He puts it back in his pocket and walks back home. Batli machshava kamaisa, he has clearly and unambiguously canceled his original desire to use the seed to plant. And now he is able to be like every other person. Pshita, it is obvious. His actions themselves indicate he's no longer interested in this item. Amar Abaya, so Abaya answers, no. There's something unique about this scenario. Here we're talking about you put it back on the shelf. He put it in the storage and he put it down gently and delicately. And it's still there, a single solitary seed. Rashi, Amar Abaya. Masnisin. He didn't explicitly change his mind. Ella, he chucked it back into the storage with all the other fruits. The process of putting the seed back in his food storage, that is an action that counteracts and cancels his original machshava. Because he didn't put it on its own little shelf. He didn't put it away specifically and separately. But ultimately, so here's the question. He put it back. He didn't set it down specifically on the place on the shelf that says single seeds for planting. But you can still see it. It didn't mix. He didn't throw it into a bucket. Let's do the Gemara again now, and let's make sure you understand. What are we talking about? He didn't explicitly say, I want to undo this. But he did bring it back from the field. He put it into the storage place, but it didn't entirely assimilate with the other seeds. It landed on its own. I would think, being that the same single solitary seed that went on a trip to the field and came back, it never was lost in the big pile of seeds. Maybe maybe it remains its original status. When he decided to take it back, put it in storage, and not plant it, he, with his actions, indicated seriously uninterested in this seed as a single seed for planting. So, just to recap, a person takes something and he plans to plant it. It doesn't matter how small it is. He is chayiv because he's designated it and he's taking it to the field. What happens if he goes back from the field and puts it away? Then it is no longer special. It is no longer designated. It's like any other seed. What if when you put it in the storage, it ends up landing by itself? Somewhere says it doesn't matter. Even if it wasn't bottled, even if it wasn't lost in the oblivion of a million seeds, but the fact that you put it back is the greatest indication that he doesn't want to keep it. My dear friends, we now have concluded the next Mishnah. I want to thank you all for joining us. Let's go a fast recap. I know this Gemara is a little bit taxing on a day that we probably want to take it easy. So I want to thank you all. Again, our Gemara had a question, complex question about a piece of food that's very small and minuscule. It lowered the threshold of prohibited Shabbos carrying, but it also, in the same moment that it was being carried or thrown, I should say, it also triggered another halachic reaction, the issue of Tumah. And our question was, because it was effective, because it triggered a reaction for the purposes of Tumah, maybe it's considered chashuv for carrying, or maybe not. We tried to bring in a Mishnah to bring proof conclusively that it's not a problem. We rejected that proof, and we left it with a question mark. We had a few different mishalim to understand why we might celebrate or give extra weight to this little piece of food. Maybe it's like a lulav or an esrog or a hadas into the four kinds. Maybe it's like the last quarter for $9.75 for your can of Coke in the amusement park. Whatever it is, on one hand, it's special. It's chashuv because it does something big. It punches above its weight. But on the flip side, it ultimately is just what it is. It's one little piece of fragrant of food, and Shabbos carrying is only the measure. I think we know where the professor comes down in this debate, and I think you explained it well. Yasher koyach. And the last point that we just studied was about when the person puts the item back on the shelf, he brings it back from the field, and he, with his actions, does undesignate that single seed as something chashuv, even if you could still find it later on. And that was today's Gemara. And before we put on record, we had a lengthy discussion about Shava Mitzvahs B'nei Noyach and conversion. And so if you weren't here live, I'm sorry you missed out on it, but I would like to give an invitation. If your schedule is flexible, every day with Hashem's help, from 10 to 11, Talmud, one page, one line at a time. So I want to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. Have an abundance of good news, healthy news, happy news, and things to celebrate. And hopefully see everyone tomorrow. Gesundheit and Freiligkeit.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Oh.
Yasher koach.
Yes, you go.
Thank you all.